Do you feel it too, Julian? Maverick's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the quiet of the kitchen like a blade. His eyes held mine, unflinching, and I could feel the weight of his words settling into the space between us. Feel what? I stammered, though I knew exactly what he meant. The air was thick, charged with something I couldn't name but could no longer ignore. I turned away, busying myself with the sink, but my hands trembled under the cool water. It hadn't always been like this. It started subtly, the way most things do. Maverick had always been around, our shared father keeping us tethered in a loose, familial way. We weren't close, not really. He was the half-brother I saw at holidays, the one who sent a text on my birthday but never lingered in conversation. He was there, but not there. Until he was. The first time I noticed the shift, we were in the living room. Maverick had come over unexpectedly, something about needing to borrow a tool from the garage. He stayed longer than usual, lingering on the couch as I flipped through a book. I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unrelenting. When I finally looked up, he smiled, a small, knowing thing that made my stomach twist. "What?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Nothing," he said, leaning back. "Just, you're different than I remember." I didn't know how to respond to that. Different how? Different good? Different bad? His tone gave nothing away, but the way he looked at me, like he was seeing me for the first time, left me unsettled. The unease grew as the days turned into weeks. Maverick started showing up more often, always with some flimsy excuse. He'd help with chores, fix things around the house, or just sit with me in silence. At first, I told myself it was normal. We were family, after all. But then the touches started. A hand on my shoulder as he passed by, a brush of his leg against mine as we sat on the couch. Small, fleeting moments that shouldn't have meant anything but felt like everything. Each one sent a jolt through me, a mix of fear and something else I didn't want to name. "You're overthinking it," I muttered to myself one night, pacing the kitchen. He's just being friendly. But the way he looked at me, the intensity in his eyes, said otherwise. The tension came to a head one evening. We were in the kitchen, just the two of us, the rest of the house silent. Maverick leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me as I fumbled with a pot of coffee. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "Just tired," I lied, avoiding his gaze. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Julian," he said softly, and I froze. There was something in his voice, a vulnerability I wasn't prepared for. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "What?" He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. Then, before I could react, he closed the distance between us, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was brief, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "I can't keep pretending," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "It's killing me." "Pretending what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He exhaled, his breath warm against my skin. "That I don't feel this. That I don't feel you." The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to pull away, to laugh it off, to do anything but stand there, frozen in place. But I couldn't. His words had cracked something open inside me, something I had been trying to ignore. "Maverick," I began, my voice trembling. "We're brothers." "Half-brothers," he corrected, his gaze unwavering. "And that doesn't change how I feel." I stared at him, my mind racing. This was wrong, wasn't it? The lines were blurred, the boundaries crossed. But the way he looked at me, the raw honesty in his eyes, made it impossible to dismiss. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything," he replied, his hand brushing against mine again. "Just, let me feel this. Let us feel this." The days that followed were a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. Maverick's presence was constant, his touches lingering longer. His words laden with meaning. I tried to push him away, to remind myself of the reality of our situation, but every time I looked into his eyes, I faltered. "Do you regret it?" he asked one night, his voice soft in the darkness. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't know. The feelings he stirred in me were unfamiliar, terrifying, and yet, there was a part of me that craved them. And now, here we were, standing in the kitchen, the tension between us palpable. Maverick's eyes bore into mine, waiting for an answer I wasn't sure I could give. Do you feel it too, Julian? He repeated, his voice steady now, bolder. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. The truth was, I did. I felt it in the way his gaze lingered, in the way my skin burned at his touch. I felt it in the way my thoughts kept circling back to him, no matter how hard I tried to push them away. But saying it out loud, acknowledging it, would change everything. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that. Julian, he said again, his voice breaking through the silence. Tell me the truth. I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. And then, before I could stop myself, I whispered, yes. Maverick's eyes widened, a flicker of something relief, maybe crossing his face. He stepped closer, his hand reaching for mine. And this time, I didn't pull away. So what now? I asked, my voice barely audible. He smiled, a small, hopeful thing that made my chest ache. We figure it out. Together. The moment stretched, the air between us crackling with unspoken promises and fears. I knew we were standing on the edge of something that could either break us or bind us together in ways I couldn't yet understand. And as Maverick's fingers intertwined with mine, I realized that, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. The days that followed Maverick's confession were a tangled mess of quiet moments and lingering glances. Our home, once a place of comfortable silence, now felt charged with something I couldn't quite name. I found myself hyper-aware of his presence, the way his voice carried through the house, the way he moved, fluid, confident, as if the world bent to his will. And yet, there was a softness to him now, a vulnerability he only seemed to show me. It was late one evening when I found myself in the kitchen, my trembling hands fumbling with the handle of the tea kettle. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the room, but my thoughts were louder, a cacophony of confusion and longing. I didn't hear him enter, but I felt it, the shift in the air, the warmth of his body as he stepped closer. You're up late, Maverick said, his voice low and smooth, like a thread pulling me back to him. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My heart was pounding, my breath catching in my throat. Couldn't sleep, I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the sound of the kettle beginning to whistle. He moved then, his hand brushing against mine as he reached to turn off the stove. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel the heat of him, the way his body seemed to radiate an energy that I couldn't ignore. Neither could I, he admitted, his tone soft, almost hesitant. I finally turned to face him, my eyes meeting his in the dim light of the kitchen. There was something in his gaze, something raw and unguarded that made my chest tighten. He was standing so close, his presence overwhelming in a way that made my head spin. Maverick, I started, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? How could I possibly articulate the whirlwind of emotions churning inside me? He reached up, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. The gesture was tender, intimate, and it left me breathless. You're always so hard on yourself, Julian, he murmured, his voice a soft caress. You don't have to figure everything out right now. I swallowed hard, my hands instinctively clutching the edge of the counter behind me for support. I don't know what this means, I admitted, my voice trembling. His hand lingered near my face, his thumb brushing against my cheek in a way that made my knees weak. It doesn't have to mean anything right now, he said softly. We can just be together. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I wanted to believe him, to let myself sink into the comfort of his words, but the fear was still there, lurking in the back of my mind. What if, I started, my voice barely above a whisper. What if this changes everything? He stepped closer, his body now mere inches from mine. I could feel the warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breath. Maybe it's supposed to, he said, his voice firm but gentle. Sometimes things need to change. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. His hand moved to my shoulder, his touch grounding me in a way that I hadn't realized I needed. When I opened my eyes again, he was looking at me with an intensity that made my heart ache. I'm scared, I admitted, my voice breaking. He nodded, his expression softening. Me too, he said. But I think it's worth it. You're worth it. The sincerity in his voice broke something inside me, a wall I hadn't realized I'd built. Before I could think, before I could second-guess myself, I reached out and wrapped my arms around him, pulling him into a tight embrace. He seemed surprised at first, but then his arms were around me, holding me close, his chin resting on the top of my head. We stood like that for what felt like an eternity, the silence of the kitchen wrapping around us like a blanket. In that moment, everything else faded away, the fear, the uncertainty, the weight of the world. There was just him and me, and the unspoken bond that had always been there, waiting for us to acknowledge it. When we finally pulled away, his hands lingered on my shoulders, his eyes searching mine. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady. "Together." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. And as he leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we could. But the uncertainty was still there, lurking in the shadows of my mind. The next few days were a blur of stolen moments and quiet conversations, each one drawing us closer in ways I hadn't anticipated. There was a new ease between us, a familiarity that felt both comforting and terrifying. It was one evening, as we sat on the couch, the flickering light of the TV casting shadows across the room, that Maverick finally broke the silence. "Do you ever think about the future?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I turned to look at him, my heart skipping a beat at the intensity in his gaze. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the arm of the couch. "Just, what comes next? For us." The question hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded. I swallowed hard, my mind racing with 1,000 responses. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Me neither," he said. "But I think I want you in it. My future." The words hit me like a punch to the chest, stealing the breath from my lungs. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my ears. "Maverick." He turned to face me fully, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach flip. "I mean it, Julian. I don't know what this is or where it's going, but I know I want you there. With me." His words were like a balm to my soul, easing the ache I hadn't realized I was carrying. But the fear was still there, a constant hum in the back of my mind. "What if?" I started, my voice trembling. "What if this changes everything? What if we lose what we have?" He reached out, his hand gently cupping my cheek. "What if we don't?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "What if this is just the beginning?" I closed my eyes, letting his words sink in. His hand felt warm against my skin, grounding me in a way that made the chaos in my mind quiet down. "I don't know if I'm ready," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "That's okay," he said. "We don't have to figure it all out right now. We can take it slow, one step at a time." I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze. There was a calmness in his eyes, a steadiness that made the fear in my chest ease just a little. "Together?" he asked, his voice soft but hopeful. I nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "Together." He leaned in then, his forehead resting against mine once more. The moment stretched, the air between us thick with unspoken promises and fears. But before I could say anything more, before I could let myself sink into the comfort of his words, Maverick pulled away slightly, his eyes searching mine. "Julian," he started, his voice uncertain. "Yeah?" He hesitated, his hands still resting against my cheek. "Can I?" His voice trailed off, but the question hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded. I knew what he was asking, even if he couldn't quite bring himself to say it. My heart was pounding in my chest, the fear and longing warring inside me. But in that moment, all I could focus on was the warmth of his hand, the steady beat of his heart beneath my palm. "Yes," I whispered, the word barely audible. And then he was leaning in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft, tentative, but filled with a longing that made my head spin. But before I could fully lose myself in the moment, Maverick pulled away, his eyes searching mine. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his breath warm against my lips. I nodded, my heart racing in my chest. "I'm sure." And just as he leaned in again, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment, pulling us back to reality. The sound of the front door opening was like a cold splash of water, pulling me out of the warmth that had been building between Maverick and me. My heart, which had been pounding with a mix of excitement and fear, now thudded heavily in my chest. Maverick's eyes widened, and he took a step back, creating distance between us that felt like a chasm. The air in the room shifted, charged with tension, but of a different kind now, one that screamed danger, be careful. I started, but Maverick was already moving toward the door, his face unreadable. I followed him, my hands trembling at my sides. Dad stood in the doorway, juggling a bag of groceries and his keys. He looked up, startled to see us both standing there. "Oh, hey, didn't expect you two to be up this late," he said, his tone casual, oblivious to the storm swirling between us. "Just couldn't sleep," Maverick said quickly, his voice steady, though I could hear the slight edge to it. He stepped forward and took the grocery bag from Dad, his movements smooth, practiced. I forced a smile, though it felt brittle. "Yeah, same. Thought I'd grab a snack." Dad nodded, seemingly satisfied with our explanation. "Well, don't stay up too late. Early day tomorrow." He brushed past us, heading toward the kitchen, and I exchanged a fleeting glance with Maverick. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but I could feel the weight of what had almost happened hanging between us. As Dad disappeared into the kitchen, Maverick turned to me, his voice low. "We should talk." My stomach twisted. Talk. That word felt heavy, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to face. But I nodded anyway because what else could I do? We couldn't just pretend nothing had happened, or almost happened. We retreated to the living room, the space suddenly feeling too small, too confined. Maverick sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped together, his shoulders tense. I perched on the armchair across from him, my fingers fidgeting in my lap. The silence between us was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of Dad rummaging in the kitchen. "Julian," Maverick began, his voice quiet but firm. "I need to know, really know, if this is something you want." Because he hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Because it's not just about me. It's about us. And I don't want to. I can't risk losing you." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. How could I even begin to explain the whirlwind of emotions inside me? The confusion, the fear, the desire, it was all too much. "I don't know," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I want. This isn't easy, Maverick. It's not simple." He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine. "I know it's not. But I need you to be honest with me. With yourself. Because us, it's not something we can just ignore." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. What if we're wrong? What if we're making a mistake? He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze unwavering. What if we're not? What if this is the best thing that's ever happened to us? Are you willing to walk away from that because of fear? I didn't have an answer for him. How could I? Fear was all I could feel right now, fear of what this meant, fear of what it could do to us, to our family. But beneath that fear, there was something else, something I couldn't quite name, but couldn't ignore either. "I don't want to walk away," I said finally, my voice trembling. "But I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, Maverick." He stood then, crossing the space between us in 2 quick strides. He knelt in front of me, his hands resting lightly on my knees. "You're stronger than you think, Julian. And you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. But you have to trust me. Trust us." His words were a lifeline, and I clung to them, desperate for something solid to hold on to. But still, the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. What if it's too much? I whispered, my voice breaking. What if we can't handle it? He reached up, his hand brushing against my cheek, sending a shiver down my spine. Then we'll face it. Together. His touch was warm, comforting, but it also stirred something deep inside me, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel until now. I leaned into his hand, my eyes closing as I took a shaky breath. "Julian," he murmured, his voice low and full of something I couldn't name. "I need you to know, this isn't just about wanting you. It's about needing you. About needing us." My heart ached at his words, and I opened my eyes to find his gaze locked on mine, intense and unwavering. In that moment, I felt something shift between us, something profound and undeniable. But before I could respond, the sound of Dad's footsteps in the hallway made us both freeze. Maverick pulled away quickly, returning to the couch just as Dad appeared in the doorway. "You two okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed in concern. "We're fine," Maverick said, his voice steady, though I could hear the strain beneath it. "Just talking." Dad nodded, seemingly satisfied. Well, don't stay up too late. Big day tomorrow. He disappeared down the hall, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maverick's eyes met mine, and I could see the tension in his expression, the unspoken questions hanging between us. "We should get some sleep," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. I nodded, though sleep was the last thing on my mind. As I stood to leave, Maverick reached out, his fingers brushing against mine for the briefest of moments. It was a small gesture, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me, a reminder of what we were risking, of what we were trying to build. "Good night, Julian," he murmured, his voice soft, almost tender. "Good night," I whispered back, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned and headed down the hall. But even as I climbed into bed, my mind was still racing, still trying to make sense of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come.